Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 243rd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And this month's podcast series is all about decolonisation. And today I'm going to be talking about decolonising in arts and heritage sector. And speaking of doing things differently and conversations on race and mental health, have you watched my TEDx talk? It's about the connection between culture, race, and mental health in the workplace. It's something you can watch in your break as it's just 12 minutes long. The link is in the show notes and I'll also give it to you here. It is bit.ly/TEDx, that's TEDx, Wolves, WOLVESLO. And I really hope you enjoy it because it was a labour of love. And if you did, please leave a positive comment on YouTube, share and like. Also, don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. So last week, I talked about education and the curriculum, or curricula plural, and what decolonisation might look like. And if you missed that, do check out episode 242 if you're interested in knowing more. So thinking about the arts and heritage sector, this is really interesting in terms of how do we, first of all, define it? And within the arts and heritage world, there are some different definitions. And being on the board of trustees of an arts and heritage organisation, this has been of interest to me learning. So I'm using definitions from a paper from University of Reading in 2018 by A. Brown, E. Russell, G. Ward and L. Zishka, entitled Art, Culture and Heritage in Reading, University of Reading. So they talk about art being a creative product or expression, culture related to people, the different ways they relate and the different things they produce. That's an interesting definition on culture. And if you want to know more, do check out my episodes 106 to 109, all about culture, cultural awareness. I review the book Culture Map, etc. Interesting definition in this context. And heritage is about culture and arts passed down to us. Now, that's not the only definition, but I think it's interesting and how heritage can be thought of as more as collections in the way in which people might bid for heritage funding. Heritage can also be buildings, and art can be more allied to the visual aesthetics. But I thought it was helpful to have a definition so we can root this. And then if we think about decolonisation in relation to arts and heritage, I found some really useful definitions. The first one from the University of Arts London's Decolonising Centre. So they talk about challenging colonial and imperial legacies, disrupting ways of seeing, listening, thinking and making in order to drive cultural, social and institutional change. I think that's really, really interesting. UNESCO's definition. Heritage narratives and processes have often been defined and implemented in ways that are exclusionary, colonizing, and sometimes contested. It is fundamental to acknowledge that there is no universal or right, quote unquote, model, and people-centered approaches are required to reduce inequalities and embrace diversity. I thought that was really, really helpful. So they go on to say cultural heritage constitutes a powerful tool to foster dialogue, inclusion, and implementation of people-centered approaches. Heritage, including shared values and memories, can support human connection, solidarity, and resilience. If not adequately recognized and managed, it can perpetuate injustice, conflict, and colonialism. So that is very useful. And I've put the link in the show notes as well. And then finally, from Concealed Art, really great article about decolonising our cultural spaces. So the definition here is decolonisation in museums and galleries recognises and acknowledges the histories of people without whom our art and historical collections would not exist. And that word historical collections is interesting because that to me links to heritage. It seeks to bring to the fore the stories of those who have been erased or whose history has been appropriated, and allows other narratives to be spoken loudly and proudly. Within the heritage and arts sector in the UK, there has been a rapid growth in schemes to decolonise collections and to turn the curatorial process on its head. There is a focus on how organisations store, display and write about their objects, and in some cases even returning objects. So that was very, very useful. And I think that point about appropriation is an interesting one. So why should you care about this? You're just going to work, maybe you don't have anything to do with the arts and heritage sector, but I think it's important to acknowledge, and this is, there's a really, really wonderful guide that's been developed from the museum associations, and I've put the link in the show notes, and it's called Supporting Decolonisation in Museums. And they say that many museums in the UK are part of the legacy of British colonialism through the collections they steward, their institutional histories, structure and wealth, and the stories they tell. Throughout history, museums have helped to make the case for colonialism by collecting and cataloguing empire and by advancing racist and prejudiced views of the world. Such views and attitudes still exist today. Museums can and must play their part in righting past wrongs and creating a better world for all those affected by colonialism. Links with access, class, inspiration, and future foundations. Decolonising involves creatively reimagining the way museums work, who they work with, and what they value. It covers all areas of practice and creates a framework to better support people and institutions. Decolonising is a collective activity which can be messy, thoughtful, imaginative, and emotional. It is driven by the desire for justice and equity in that it aims to rebalance power and representation away from the colonizer narrative of history and society. This work is intersectional as it challenges structural inequalities across the board to redress forms of historic and ongoing harm. I think that's absolutely beautifully written, I have to be honest. And I think that the other thing about this is whether you work in the arts and heritage sector or not, or you're interested in it like me, we all have a role to play in this. And I then come to a really great article that was in the Huffington Post by Catherine Ross, founder and director of the National Caribbean Heritage Museum. And her point, I think, is really excellent because she says it's really important to remember that colonial isn't just a historical concept referring to the bygone days of the British Empire. And there were a couple of things I really wanted to pick up from this article, but by all means, please do read the whole thing. For many, it's a living, breathing reality inherent in all of the UK's power structure, that their social and cultural capital and fundamental rights are still all too often intrinsically linked to their race and the colour of their skin. And this is so important, that whole idea about power structures, legacies of museums in the UK, the cataloguing, that point that the Museums Association very clearly put about cataloguing and how it played into empire. It's difficult to see culture being decolonised while the power and influence behind it is still rooted in the same old power structures, politically, economically, and creatively. And this is the key thing. And if you've done any workshops with me, you know I talk about this pyramid, the hierarchy model. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and you want to keep up to date. If so, why not join my newsletter? When you join my mailing list, you'll receive my white paper on inclusive language and mental health. And that link is bit.ly/ILMHCK. Now, as I said, there are lots of resources and information in this area, way more than for the workplace. And indeed, when I was researching more about inclusive curricula, and this support's really available. So I was really impressed, and it feels like the discussions may be more live in this sector. If you work in the sector, which I don't, there seems to be the ongoing discussions which seem to have faded away in more mainstream workplaces. But I want to think more broadly about this concept of decolonising museums and arts and heritage space for all of those who access art, heritage. And I'm thinking broad brushstroke. This could also be the kind of films we go to see, even though that's not technically part of arts and heritage, but arts in terms of how people define arts and how they access it, which we can all do. We can all shift the status quo. So as I said in previous episodes, I think one of the first things is to know the history and background of any museum. And that's not to say we stop going to it, we stop patronizing them, we stop supporting them, but to find out what the legacy was and really opening your eyes to it. And the hidden collections. So often some museums do tours of their collections, and it is worth asking questions about the collections they have and what could be brought to the fore. And that's indeed what happened with a series called the Castor paintings. The second thing is, what about giving money to save paintings, reparations, but also to support communities who would like to build their heritage collections? So one of the big gaps in this country is particularly around, Black archivy, and Serendipity Arts do have a black digital archive amongst a physical archive. Now, of course, there are funds that people can apply to, but if it's a small community group, that can be really tricky. So how could you input into that in some way and find out actually, is there a discussion to be had about what kinds of heritage collections are needed in your area and how they could be hosted? Support events which don't get all the attention and the best reviews. And I think that's really important because there's a kind of people power in writing reviews, talking about it, telling your friends. If you went to see something good, take a friend with you the next time or take someone who'd be interested and really shout about it, because the critics will go for the big things, the big gigs, and often the smaller things in region and local areas get ignored. And they can be really, really great. And obviously, if the attention amps up, there is possibility for funding for them to travel. So that's another thing. Now, the fourth thing is, what about writing to museums about how you enjoyed an exhibition or any questions you had? And I actually have done this. So in 2015, I went to an exhibition at the Tate Britain, and I wrote an email about the representation, and I wanted to read out the response I got. So um, and actually, it was from a visitor. It was from an information assistant, and I thought it was really well written in the sense that I wasn't expecting a response, so I put it on a card. And in fact, I bumped into some other art goers from the Black community at this particular exhibition, and I said, "Oh, I'd really love to have a chat with you." And we had this really long conversation. So that's another thing about connecting with fellow arts goers, but. So they said, Dear Layla, thanks for your comments regarding representation of Black and Asian artists following your visit to the Tate on 16th August 2015. The Tate collection has been growing since the original Tate Gallery. Now Tate Britain came into being in 1897. See, there's the history bit, right? The global and diverse perspective we now want to reflect our audiences and communities sadly did not exist in the attitudes of collectors 100 years ago, or even 30 to 40 years ago. Now, yes, I mean, I do agree with that, the mainstream rich collectors, but what about those pieces of arts that have kind of gone walkies? But I think, at least they're acknowledging that. Also, art collected historically represented the art that received exposure then, which absolutely happens now, which regrettably wasn't as diverse as it should have been. In this sense, the Tate collection is a consequence of historical past decisions. I agree that many artists have not been given the exposure they deserve. And I think what I might have written was I might have mentioned some artists, but recently there have been many exhibitions, events, and film programs held at Tate that strive to redefine these historical positions of misrepresentation and rewriting the historical canon of art to include Black, Asian, and minority ethnic artists. At Tate Britain, there is the current display, Spaces of Black Modernism, which was there at the time. They then go on to talk to me about an extensive film program, artists living in LA in the 1970s. This program sought to make links to similar artists working with similar struggles for justice during the civil rights movement, such as Black Audio Film Collective, whose work is in the Tate collection, which some of you might like to go to see. The film title Handsworth Songs, the link to the series, and they've given me the link. And they've also talked to me about a series of upcoming Sankofa film and video collection at Tate Britain, Black independent film collective that was formed in the 1980s, and they were very determined to tell their own stories. This series, I mean, it was 2015, so it was starting in early September, but I mean, it's worth having a look. And then they end by saying, I hope this goes some way to answer your question. We will be including your comments and feedback to Tate Visitor Comments Report for August 2015. The report is circulated and read by management curators and the directorate who will read your feedback. So my point really is that it's definitely worth doing, and that's a big museum, but we can even have conversations. We don't have to write in if it's a smaller museum or heritage or collection that we'd like to see. And I think there is an onus to respond in terms of how people are responding to visitors and how people are interacting with displays. Then, it's not simply what we physically see, but digital archives, as I mentioned previously, they're a really key part of this process and how we can contribute to this, how we can ask for digital archives. There's also a very interesting digital archive for the Sikh community based on, it's very much a heritage collection, actually, digital, but particular jewelry, things from Sikh legacy, really, really interesting. So digital archives are going to be very important. Then why not get yourself on a board and raise the issues using the information from within the sector? You might not have been a trustee member before, but it's something that's worth doing. Yes, you have to think about time. They're not paid, they're not remunerated positions, but definitely great to have a discussion. Or even if you can be a board observer or say, I've got some things I'd like to bring up to the board. Can someone take this to the board for me? These things are all worth it. And then I think it's also about access through languages, the depth and beauty of all languages and key languages. If we're trying to get certain people to a space, and remember, I'm not saying people don't speak English. English is a pretty straightforward, easy language compared to languages that are gendered, that have cases. But how do we want to do that? And then working with communities about which languages. And yes, someone may speak and read and understand English very, very well, but they may also want things in a mother tongue, how they describe as a mother tongue, or specific events run by community leaders who are fluent in languages and in different languages and can do that. So that's really, really important, I think. And then finally, shout about who's doing it well, which links to, you might want to leave a review if you've gone to a good exhibition, but really have a look at who you think is doing it well, who is talking about repatriation in a really useful way, who's talking about redefining the perspective. So when you go and see particular heritage collections, the wording, that's so important. Who's doing it well? And can we role model? Instead of shaming, can we look at the role models and encourage people to build on what they're already learning? So I really hope you found this useful. I don't know anyone who solved it, but maybe you work in the arts and heritage sector and you think, yes, we've definitely cracked it. Unless I think there are organizations that are set up by global majority people with a focus on global majority arts and heritage. I think that that's obviously done really well because it comes from a place of deep knowledge. But I don't think the big museums and arts and heritage and collections have solved it. But it is an ongoing journey. As we, as I've said at the end of every single episode in this series, we really can't undo 500 plus years of colonialism in a day. Fasten your seatbelts, get ready, think about your involvement, whether it's in the workplace, in terms of education, in terms of arts and heritage. And if this is a subject you'd like to know more about for your workplace, don't forget I run workshops, training sessions, and keynotes for organizations all about this and anti-racism. Please get in touch to find out more about how I could help you at Layla, Leyla, at diverseminds.co.uk. And I really hope you've enjoyed the show. And if so, please write me a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And as always, you can email me and I'd love to hear from you. And I do respond to all emails that I receive from listeners. And there's also a whole host of resources in the show notes. And don't forget podcast episode 233 to 235, all about white dominant norms, and podcast episodes 106 to 109 about culture. So next week will be the final episode in the series, and we're going to be talking about repatriation. And until then, everyone, take care, and I look forward to connecting with you in the next episode. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.